Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Classical Wisdom event, The Philosophy of Anxiety. We have three really esteemed panelists, and I've been telling them how excited I have been about preparing for this event. It has been really illuminating, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So let me introduce you to our fantastic speakers. We have Samir Chopra. He is a philosophical counselor and professor emeritus at philosophy at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author and co-author of many books, very wide-ranging topics, including Shahram Benegal, philosopher and filmmaker, A Legal Theory for Autonomous Artificial Agents, and Eye on Cricket, Reflections on the Great Game. His essays have appeared in The Nation, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Aeon, Psyche, and other publications, and his most recent book, of which we'll be discussing today, is Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. We also have Katherine D. Van Schaik, MD, PhD, and MA. She is a faculty member in the Department of Radiology and Radiological Sciences at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, with additional appointments in the Department of Classical and Mediterranean Studies and the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Vanderbilt University. Quite a high achiever. She's received her PhD in Ancient History from the Harvard Department of Classics and her MD from the Harvard Medical School, after completing studies in classics and molecular and cellular biology at Harvard College. She is also the author of a recent book as well on how to be healthy, an ancient guide to wellness. So she has very particular insights on this topic. And finally, we have Michael Fontaine, professor in the Department of Classics at Cornell University, New York, and author of many books and articles. His books have been reviewed in countless publications, including Forbes, Spectator, The Daily Beast, The Times Literary Supplement, The Daily Mail, and Wine Spectator. He's the author of several publications, including How to Tell a Joke, The Pig War, How to Drink, The Classical Guide to Imbibing, and relevant to this book, to this conversation, is How to Grieve, an Ancient Guide to the Lost Consolation, as well as his next book, How to Get Over a Breakup, a translation of Ovid's Remedia Amoris, which comes out in June. So as you can see, we have a very wide-ranging of expertise and knowledge to this conversation. And I want to thank you three for joining us today. I think we're going to have a really good, interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Anya, for the invitation.
Now, I told them at first, I had this idea that, they would each come with their different perspectives. And in some ways, Samir has written a lot about Buddhism, so kind of maybe a spirituality aspect. Katherine has written about Galen, so a sort of medicinal aspect. And Michael does a lot with philosophy, and so could talk about all the philosophers. And it quickly dawned on me that doesn't really work, because so much of Buddhism does relate to Stoicism. So much of Galen was affected by philosophy. So much of the philosophers were affected by the Hippocratic school. So it really immediately became way too messy. So I'm going to just sort of open up this floor and let you guys talk. But let's discuss at the very beginning, what is anxiety in the first place and why does it exist? And I think maybe I'm going to turn to Samir to kind of get us started on this.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks very much for having me on. And I think that's a great question to kick things off, because I think it'll very quickly put us into contact with the kind of variety and multiplicity that anxiety commands, both in its range of symptoms, the kinds of descriptions that people give to it, and the very fact that it seems to emerge to us as a kind of perennial condition of mankind. I think every age or every era is fond of describing itself as being particularly anxious. And you see these kinds of descriptions increase with frequency in history as important changes occur in the broader cultural context. And one of the things I like about today's conversation is that I've written a philosophical guide to anxiety. And one of the first things I say in the book is that this term seems to cover so many emotions, so many moods, so many feelings, so many disciplines seem to claim ownership of anxiety. So I think one really useful point of conversation today would be to acknowledge that it is multiple, it is multifarious, it is perennial, and to ask ourselves, what kinds of descriptions have people given of anxiety in the past? The concerns that animate our anxieties seem to largely center in my work, and I'll talk more about this in the philosophers I've consulted, around, the fears of death and nothingness. And this is an ancient concern. I think the two scholars here who are ancient scholars will tell us that this is a very ancient concern. And I think a far more modern fear that comes up is what I would call the fear of the loss of love, and or fear of a certain kind of disapproval, or a certain kind of anxiety that I might be doing something wrong, which can of course very quickly become religious anxiety, I am sinning. But it can also become what I call secular anxiety, that I am living my life in the wrong way. There is some particular way in which I am supposed to be living my life, and if I don't live this life in the right way, then I will lose the love and the approval of those that matter most to me. Death, of course, is the ultimate loss of love, because we lose all that we love and hold dear. But this other kind of cosmic fear of the loss of love is also, I think, that animates anxiety in its modern incarnations. So I would conclude my sort of rather long-winded response to your question by saying it's a very difficult term to define, but I am quite confident that it is universal and perennial, and it spans space and time and cultures and histories.
Katherine, do you want to jump in maybe with an aspect of, say, how Galen would have seen what anxiety was? Was it ever sort of addressed directly by him?
It was, and building on Samir's point, this is something that is a universal through culture and through time, although the names and the descriptions of anxiety are, of course, variable. For Galen, the term that I think most closely maps onto what we would consider anxiety is lupe, or distress. It's often translated distress. And it really does, as he describes in his treatise, Avoiding Distress, relate to fear of loss. And in the treatise that we have, part of which I've included in the book, he describes his own process of coping with the loss of material goods that were both very valuable intrinsically and sentimentally and intellectually important for him. So absolutely, this is something that is found in Galen, is explicitly discussed in the writings of Galen, although the terminology and the way we have chosen to translate it over time might not make it seem that anxiety as such is discussed, but of course it is, and it was discussed in the works that antedated Galen. I think what's also particularly important about Galen's perspective, if I'm discussing this from the perspective of a physician and historian and translator, is his struggles with his clear recognition that anxiety as a soul state or as a mental state has a physical and physiological component to it very clearly, but it's often difficult for him to pin down the precise nature of that physiology, although he knows it's there. And he provides some really interesting case studies to illustrate that, one of which I've included in the book, which, to build on your point, Samir, relates to lovesickness, actually. So that's one of his cases that illustrate the way that the body and the soul interact with one another. And so I think that idea of losing love, or of anxiety about love, or a fear of loss about love, is actually readily apparent in Galen's works in the setting of his discussion of the way that the soul state can interact with the body, and the body can manifest that distress. So I'll just leave some of those points there, and hopefully we can come back to some of those depending on the way the conversation goes. But I'm eager to hear what Mike has to say as well.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'm interested in the topic from both angles we just heard about, and several others. I did some reading around to get ready for us. And the main source in the Roman tradition, the philosophical tradition, is going to be a book by Cicero called the Tusculan Disputations. And book 3 is specifically on sort of facing down your fears. And so everybody loves the Stoics. So they have, sure enough, their own plan. But he talks also about the Epicureans, which was the rival school of philosophy, and some other perspectives. And I'm going to just circle back to a couple of things we heard. Samir talked about, sort of death and the loss of love. And those do seem to be the two fundamentals, even just loss in general. But loss of love is when that really gets everybody. Mm-hmm. And also with Galen, he's sort of interesting because he was a doctor and a philosopher. I think that's right, like a Platonic philosopher. So he's got both perspectives. And in America, at least, I know a lot of us are signing on from the United States. I mean, everybody in America knows anxiety is a medical condition, but that's not necessarily true around the world. Certainly was not true until about 300 years ago, maybe not even 300 years ago. I see somebody just put in about Freud. He actually is the pivotal figure in a lot of this. But so I thought you'd be interested. What do the Stoics say about anxiety? And they have sort of a fourfold distinction. One is about happiness. Their basic idea is you have sort of your even state, and then something can knock you off kilter. Something makes you unbalanced. It already sounds like something out of Star Wars. But the idea was that you can be afraid right now. Like if you're going through turbulence in an airplane, that's something that really scares me to death. And then anxiety is just future fear, right? So you're projecting that fear into the future. That's how they look at it. And so there's two ways of getting rid of it. You can either get rid of the future, and no philosopher recommends suicide, so we're going to take that one off the table. And the other is to face down your fears. And that was the Stoics' way of doing it. We'll probably hear more about that. Some of you already know about what the Stoic big thing about the premeditation of problems and so on. And then Cicero represents the Epicurean view, which is completely the opposite. It is avoidance. Stop thinking about the bad stuff because you can't do anything about it. And I wouldn't say, and maybe we'll hear more about this, I wouldn't be the one to tell you what's better, because both of those philosophies obviously worked for a huge number of people for a long time. So I just thought I'd throw some of that out there, and maybe see how that sounds in the modern context. Maybe Samir, what you think about that?
Thanks very much, Catherine and Michael, for those great responses. I'm also looking at some of the great responses that are coming up in the chat, and they're very rich, I must say. I must say thanks to our audience for these comments as well. I think one thing I wanted to seize upon and just build on to make anxiety a perennial condition, and so also related to the modern conditions that people are talking about, the ways in which our societies are organized can make us anxious, right? So particular societies can be more anxious than others depending upon their politics. I think this is where anxiety, besides having a medical dimension and having a spiritual dimension, which is concern about our fates in the afterworld, if there is one, there is also what I would call materialist anxiety caused by the way that we have chosen to organize our lives, chosen to organize our relationships with other people, right? So there's this human material aspect to it. I would say the one thing that really deeply connects ancient traditions across cultures and space and time, like Buddhism, Stoicism, ancient Greek philosophy, is what I call a kind of reckoning with the existential parameters of our existence, right? The fact that we are creatures who are conscious, who live in time, and that this time is finite. I think if you take these three existential parameters, consciousness, finiteness of time, and also a living in time such that I remember the past, I regret the past, and I anxiously anticipate the future. This is the basis of my extended personality through time. The fact that I ascribe to myself an identity in the past and I imagine for myself a future. Once you have these conditions in place, you are going to be anxious, right? Your knowledge is limited of the world. Your capacities are limited. You're bound to be anxious. And I think this is where the Buddha, he says in some sense, so long as you ascribe to yourself an enduring self, one which is the subject of fortunes and misfortunes, one which is born, which endures and dies, you are going to be anxious because you are going to be anxious about its fate. So in some sense, to rescue yourself from spiritual suffering, from dukkha or dukkha, which is, existential suffering for the Buddha, was in some ways to really come to a reckoning with the identity that you had granted to yourself as this thing that endured through time, that had fates and fortunes. Once you do that, you're anxious. So I think the Buddhist idea that in some sense, the thesis of no self is the thing that will rescue you from this kind of unnecessary suffering was very much an intellectual maneuver. You suffer because you are confused about the kind of thing you are. Remove this confusion and you stand a chance of relieving yourself from this suffering. But the fear that is underwriting it, the fear that I've noticed that I am in time, that all things come to be, that this is an eternally becoming world, that all things come to be and pass away, this is cause and occasion for anxiety. And I think this existential noticing of anxiety, I think, is quite present in all the ancient traditions that we are invoking.
Would that then be very much affected by different cultures' perceptions of time? I mean, I know that obviously some cultures based inherently in the Chinese language, you don't have tenses as much versus I know in English-speaking cultures, we're much more focused on seeing time as a linear aspect, whereas some more Latin cultures are more momentarily. If we kind of have this idea of time as a straight line that's constantly racing along that we really have in the West, would that kind of inherently make us more anxious?
I think so. And I think a focus on future as well. I'm not a native speaker of Arabic, but studied it for 5 years and I think Italian does this some as well, that in English, where we might use the future, these languages use the present. And in Arabic, there is this tendency to, when the future tense is used, which is rarely, it's always with the God willing, right? So there is that element of uncertainty and anxiety, and then a linguistic focus on a certain presentism, which I think is important to keep in mind, and speaks to your point, Anya, about the way we express ourselves. If we're projecting ourselves more into the future, then of course that will create the possibility of anxiety, because then those are the moments when we might have loss. We anticipate loss, we anticipate death. So of course we anticipate loss in the future. And I think Galen speaks to that himself, living in an atmosphere of political uncertainty and seeing many of his friends and colleagues lose property, lose their lives, lose family members. And then himself in a bit of an accident, losing so much of his library. It burned down, and it included not just his books, but also pharmacological materials that he had gathered over decades of travel, bespoke surgical instruments. It was crushing for him. And I think his recognition of, again, to speak to your point, Samir, of these are things that will happen. Look to what you have with you right now in this moment. And then I don't want to say don't concern yourself about the future. I think Galen was in a way concerned about posterity and about the future and about the mark he would leave on the world. But when confronted with the prospect of loss, or even when confronted with actual loss, grounding oneself in the present moment is really, in a way similar to what you're describing, Samir, that involves a conscious and active and rational thought, is a kind of antidote to anxiety, and not only an antidote, but also a preventative in many ways.
Right.
Mike, do you want to add to that?
Well, you guys have me thinking about all kinds of similar things. You're talking about loss. Katie, and that treatise just came on. We just got that like 20 years ago, I think, right? The loss of his library and so on. And I thought about that when I was translating this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not even 20 years. And I read the treatise and I thought it's pretty bad, right? Like your whole house, you lose all those beautiful books behind you. But at the same time, I recently translated this book, is a recreation of Cicero on the death of his daughter. And that is where I started comparing, and thinking about in terms of anxiety, right? It's one thing, anything material can be replaced or close to it, but the human beings, right? That seems to be, in my experience, talking to friends of mine that are more anxious, that that desire to protect, when you have kids, and you can't, right? I mean, you can definitely up the odds. You can wear a seatbelt, and you can overcorrect for that kind of thing. And I see some of that, especially here in Ithaca, where I live. There's maybe a little too much in favor of risk assessment, but Samir, I thought that was what I heard you saying at the very beginning, right? Like the loss of love, and that can happen in two ways, right? Like, my wife doesn't love me any longer, my mom or dad doesn't love me, or they could actually get in a car accident or something, and then everything that makes me want to live my life is suddenly kaput. So I think about that because Cicero addresses that in that book of the Tusculan Disputations. His daughter just died, and he was trying to find a way to stop feeling so horrible. So he kind of rolls grief and anxiety together. I think those probably are distinct emotions for a lot of people today. I'm not the one to answer that, but for him, they're kind of the same. And so he quotes, I'm going to put this in a chat. I pulled it out. Some of you have heard of a guy named Chrysippus. Chrysippus was a Stoic philosopher in antiquity. And I'll put the quote in later. It's a different, but Chrysippus says that we need to prepare for tragedies. I don't have this quote here, but we need to prepare for tragedies now. Right. You have got to be aware that when you're a human being and you're born, there's certain things that are inherent to the human condition. One of them is that we're going to lose things. Horrible things will happen. And so you got to prepare. It doesn't just, that's not stuff that happens on the other side of the planet or to other people and so forth. It's how do you steel yourself for, some horrific phone call you get, and so on. The other quote, thank you, Anya, that you put in there actually was from the very beginning. His book is lost, but it's from the very beginning of a book he wrote called On Negative Emotions. And it gets to treatment, actually. And I think maybe, Katie, you can talk about that, because people seem to, when they grasp anxiety, they often want to define it by treatment. And I just thought this is kind of cool because he says, we got all these philosophers, they bicker about, when somebody's in the throes of grief or anxiety, what do you do? He says, don't worry about your loved one's personal beliefs. You use what works in the moment, and then you sort it out later on. Anyway, so I just thought maybe I'd sort of talk a bit about Stoicism. But Katie, what do you think about in terms of treatment for some of this stuff? You do, because you see it from both angles, right?
Yeah, I do. I certainly do. And I'm just hearing your comments. I'm also reflecting on seeing patients in the hospital and obviously people who are confronted with loss in some way. Maybe it's obviously it could be loss of a loved one, but also someone in a sick role, potentially loss of a future they had envisioned for themselves, or loss of certain activities that they hadn't anticipated, or individuals who have some kind of cognitive impairment and yet are still at a stage where they can see what that loss will look like. And that's its own kind of profound anxiety and grief. So thinking through just some of the comments that you made, and I think Galen as well, Mike, to speak to your point, knows that there are levels of anxiety, and he acknowledges that anxiety or fear or grief associated with torture or with death or these more severe things is not the same as the loss of his books. I think he recognizes that, obviously, and also recognizes the limitations of certain aspects of medical therapy at that level. And what I think is really remarkable about Galen in particular is that he, like we still do, struggles to think through the relationship between the body and the soul that is manifesting these emotions. He knows, according to his physiology, that the soul lives in the brain, but to what extent is it part of Crassus, part of this mixture with pneuma, with the vital substance? He grapples with this and disagrees with himself in several treatises. And sometimes he takes more of a Platonic approach to the soul, sometimes a little bit more of a Stoic approach to the soul. And it's clear that although he believes very strongly that one's behavior and one's humoral balance can, of course, influence humors and therefore influence the soul, he's aware of his own limitations in understanding the nature of that mechanism. Just like we do today, there's still so much uncertainty in knowledge of how pharmacologic therapies for psychiatric issues work. And often it's the behavioral interventions that are better, especially for something like anxiety. And I read recently, I think it was in the New Yorker or maybe the Atlantic, it was a piece by a psychiatrist who was pointing out benzodiazepines are, of course, very effective at mitigating anxiety in the short term. But the challenge is, of course, they're highly addictive. And if one is not able to come to grips with anxiety from a behavioral perspective, they really are a Band-Aid, and potentially one that could create more harm than good. So I think that's a complicated way to answer your question, is to say that Galen was clearly aware that there could be what we might call medical or physiological interventions, but that they are of limited utility. And from his perspective, the physiology by which they worked was not fully clear. And I think we're in a very similar position today.
If I just wanted to jump in, Katherine and Mike, and I was struck by something that Mike was saying about the difficulty of distinguishing between grief and anxiety in some ways. And there is, I think, there is a deep point to be made out there, which I think connects it with the Buddhist understanding of anxiety, which is that in some ways, the suffering we experience is an anticipation of grief, right? So for instance, I know that at some point in the future, in fact, it's already true for me as a middle-aged man, because I receive news of people being ill or becoming terminally ill, or people passing away. And there are times I say to my friends, man, from now on till the time I die, it's going to be a series of death notices. I'm just going to keep getting these every few months. So-and-so is terminally ill. So-and-so's treatment is stopping. And there's an anticipation of grief, knowing that all that I know and hold, love, dear, all of it will pass away, and that I will be grieving for this. I will receive notifications that will make me grieve. And it's not just that I am suffering now, it's that I know that inevitably I will suffer in the future. Especially death is one of those things that even when I look at my child, right? I might not be around to witness it, but she too will pass one day. I just hope that I'm not around when it happens. That's all. But in doing so, I am wishing that she be around to grieve for me instead. And that pains me in that sense, right? So there is a kind of inevitability of this reckoning of grieving, which is part of my suffering today. I think this is where the future is a very important part of the suffering of anxiety, because it's in the future. It's not here. But I am suffering. I'm suffering in anticipation. I saw someone in the comments write about pain. People might be reconciled to death. Like, okay, nothingness, fine. I know there'll be a time. But the pain that will precede it, the suffering that I will witness, and especially of my loved ones, like, these people are going to come to the hospital and hold my hand while I pass away? They're going to see me die? There's this reckoning of, I think love is this amazing thing that makes us actually feel bad that, oh, I'm going to make my loved ones suffer. Like my wife is going to be taking me to the emergency ward for treatment. My daughter is going to be holding the bedpan for me. Like, what? This is what awaits me. And I think it's that coloring of even joyful moments, I think, which is that Buddhist feeling or that Kierkegaardian feeling that, like, oh God, that's my child playing in the sunshine. And I know that even this happiness is threatened in some finite measure by what the world can do for us, which is where I think, Michael, to go back to your point, anxiety is a form of grieving as well. It's a form of anticipatory grieving. Just like I have anticipatory nostalgia, for instance, when I walk past my daughter's middle school and I see it, I said, oh, there'll be a time when I'll walk through this neighborhood and I'll think I used to come and pick up this little girl, at one time. It's anticipatory nostalgia, right? So I think there is something very future displaced about it. And which is why I think techniques like mindfulness and some of these ancient spiritual exercises about staying in the moment are, I think, quite as potent as they can be, because they're urging us in some ways to stay in the moment, right? And not be in the past, which is full of regret, and not be in the future, which is full of all these fearful and grieving anticipations, and just deal with what is on our plates at the moment, right?
Can I respond? So yeah, you hit a whole bunch of notes. Some of these things you were just saying about death, especially the way you described death just now, is the medicalized version of death. And I read a magnificent book very recently. I don't have it I can't put it right in the chat, but I can in a minute, by a wonderful doctor in New York City, Dr. Lydia Dugdale. And she had rediscovered the medieval idea of the art of dying well. And it's the opposite of everything you said, right? Especially in, I don't know, my small circle of the United States right now, death is a medical thing. We're gonna keep people alive at costs be damned and so forth. And she says, she's an end of life doctor. She says, this is making everybody miserable. If we could find ways to accept our mortality that people had until fairly recently, and they have elsewhere right now, we could probably be a lot happier, a lot less anxious. Dr. Van Schaik, as a doctor, what do you think of the medicalization of death and some of these things? You must deal with some of it.
It's not just death, right? It's sickness, it's childbirth, it's all of these dimensions of human health that have become siloed over time, which maybe contributes to some of the anxiety, right? It used to be that you'd have grandma or your parent sick in the parlor, and the physician would come and the priest would come, and there was just much closer association of these passages of human life, the physiological passages of human life with daily life. And I think by siloing these things in a hospital situation, it creates this an additional degree of uncertainty in a way, because so much of healthcare and of the medical profession is very opaque to most people, and the decision making around that, and how the patient is actually doing. And so that I think in some ways contributes to another level of anxiety. If you talk with most patients, I think they're also conflicted about it. Most people want most things done. At the same time, depending on how those questions are phrased, most people will also say they don't want to be on a ventilator. They don't want to be able to communicate. They don't want to be alive at all costs, whatever that looks like, however alive or dead is defined. And so there is an extraordinary amount of conflict within individuals regarding these topics. And so, go ahead, Mike.
So on the same note, I don't know about anybody else, but medical tests themselves are one of the only things in the world that make me extraordinarily anxious. Right? I mean, I almost think if we didn't have the test, would I be a happier person? Because you go to the doctor, you know. So how can we? I'm asking you as a practicing doctor, how can you reduce my anxiety about, am I going to have a heart attack or whatever it's going to be? You can imagine all kinds of stuff.
This comes up a lot, actually, in radiology specifically, because increasingly, and you may have read this in the news, there is an option available. It's expensive, a whole body MRI. So, and if you read the companies that tout this, they'll put up the testimonials of the female physician in her 30s who said, they found my lung cancer, and had that not happen, I would be dead and my children would miss me. And so there are stories like that. At the same time, what they're not telling you is what we would call an incidentaloma. So there's some finding that is questionable, and maybe that leads to a biopsy, which then leads to an infection. And so there are plenty of, not to mention the anxiety, right? And patient anxiety is actually one of the explicit considerations that affect mammography guidelines. So if you're thinking about mammograms and the way follow-ups work, calling patients back for unnecessary evaluation and patient anxiety is listed as an explicit concern that affects the development of guidelines. So I would say, Mike, you are very normal in having anxiety about medical tests, and most people do. And I think this is something that the healthcare system, in particular in the United States, is still sorting out. Just because we have a test doesn't mean we should necessarily do it. What would be the result of that test? Would it be more anxiety provoking? Would it lead to unnecessary procedures that could, in fact, have real physiological consequences that create more problems? And these are all real considerations. And of course, there is the school of thought that says AI and precision medicine are going to solve this for everybody. So everyone will have tailored therapy that's appropriate just for your own individual genetic background. And so you won't need to do anything unnecessarily. And all of your anxieties will be addressed by the computer, which itself is anxiety provoking, right? Because we don't know how these things work. So that's a long answer to your question, that I'm not entirely sure that there is a way around that, except to say that physicians have been making patients anxious for thousands of years. So again, you're in good company.
I think looking at the medical treatment of anxiety is especially interesting, because so many of the dimensions of anxiety that I think are worth talking about become clear and visible. For instance, it's not just that we are treating anxiety with medicine, we are treating anxiety with medicine in a society like ours, where medicine is understood as a commercial product, sold and marketed in particular ways, made available in particular ways, where patients are subject to certain kinds of loneliness and isolation in their treatment, which can exacerbate existing anxiety, where patients and doctors exist in a certain kind of power continuum. So sometimes, when people will wonder, Is anxiety different in a society like ours? I would say yes, it is. If people feel powerless, if they feel like they're not actually they're not enjoying solitude as much as they're suffering from loneliness, then maybe this is the kind of society that makes people anxious. People will associate capitalism with anxiety, and I would say yes, maybe there's an economic model that treats us all as atomistic, isolated individuals left alone to make choices without guidance. This is extremely anxiety provoking. Maybe the fact that my healthcare is not just provided to me, but instead I have to choose from a menu of deductibles and copays makes me super anxious. Like, I'm going to get this wrong, right? Or I'm going to get this decision wrong. I actually use this example in my book that actually medical treatment gives me anxiety all the way right till the time I die. I'm like, which treatment? This treatment or that treatment? Should I take more painkillers? Fewer painkillers? Who should I leave in my will? There's a certain kind of, I think, treatment of anxiety which can exacerbate the anxiety because it takes place in a particular context. But I think in every step, we keep on coming up with what I think are like these unalterable aspects of our anxious experiences. We don't like being lonely. We don't like losing agency. We don't like having the feeling that our lives are being judged in some dimension, whether that authority is cosmic or secular. And we are scared, I think, quite about the future as well, that I will become lonely and that I will lose all that I have. And medicine can exacerbate that under some conditions. It can, of course, make me functional and let me go back to work so that I'm not anxious about losing my job, right? If Wellbutrin or something makes me less jittery and makes me capable of going back to work, then at least I'm not anxious about losing employment, right? Which is a serious anxiety in a society like ours. So I think, to sort of amplify Catherine's point about the problems of medicine in some ways, I would say, which way we treat anxiety. Are we treating it as a spiritual phenomena, psychological phenomena, philosophical phenomena, economic phenomena? This makes a great deal of difference to the way we suffer from anxiety and the way we understand our anxiety. I think it was Nietzsche who once said, we're all going to suffer. What we don't have to do is moralize our suffering, right? We don't have to take this suffering to be, the result of the sins I've committed or some terrible things that I've done. Maybe we can just treat it as a response to suffering, to existence as a whole, right? And not necessarily as something that needs to be medicated away as quickly as possible, right?
Now, guys, I want to open us up to questions from the audience pretty shortly, but I feel like we spent a lot of time now already sort of diagnosing the problem, and that maybe a little bit of a nod, at least, to some of the potential ways to address it. And Samir, you kind of started us off about not exacerbating the anxiety by becoming anxious about it, which maybe easier said than done, depending on your situation. But there are, like, for instance, a lot of Stoic philosophies. There's a lot of points Galen makes. And so maybe I can turn to Mike or to Katherine to kind of start us off with some of the, at least, ancient tactics of addressing this.
Mike, you want to take that and I'll follow up?
I'd be happy to. So again, in Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, that's probably the best source to go to in the ancient world to look at how to deal with this problem. Not so much to conceptualize it, but he wants to be practical. Just to remind you, as I said, he had just lost his daughter and he was totally off kilter. So the Stoic view, what do you do? The Stoic view was that you need to plan ahead. That is to say, be realistic. You need to realize that when you are born, being born itself is a death sentence. You can't do anything about that, whether it's yourself or someone that, you become a parent to somebody else. Death is coming no matter what. Now, obviously, people who believe in life after death it may have an easier time with this kind of thing. People who don't may or may not have a more difficult time with this thing. But the Stoic idea was that you meditate now on the fact that we're all going to die, that everybody we love is going to die, and that on top of that, many of us are going to face horrible tragedies that we can't do anything about. Cicero, who was not a Stoic, but he was an academic skeptic, he actually decides this is helpful. And he thinks that that's the way forward. So plan now for future problems, because he quotes Chrysippus on this point. He says that unforeseen tragedies are way worse If you're in the airplane, it starts going down. Wouldn't that be worse somehow than imagining what could have happened? I don't know, but that was the way he looked at it. The opposite view Cicero discusses is the Epicurean strategy of avoidance. Now, that's not a word that exists in Latin. It's not a word he uses, but that's the best word I can think of. Epicurus's idea was he says that brooding on problems and future problems just makes you depressed. So you don't treat your anxiety by making yourself depressed. Instead, you want to focus on the good times. And I think we don't have Epicurus's own words, and Cicero's being critical, but I think what Epicurus was trying to say is you want to focus on how good you already have it, right? So even if you face a tragedy and you lose a finger in some industrial accident, well, you still have 9 more. That's what you want to focus on, and not worry about ways you could lose the other 9. And then I would like to know, actually, Dr. Van Schaik, does anybody recommend group exercise? Because for me personally, I find that physical exercise in groups of people works better than anything out there in the whole wide world to make me feel better.
So on that point, actually, Galen actually does recommend the exercise with the small ball, and that may be what you're gesturing towards, but not for anxiety specifically. He talks about, and I've included this in the book actually, and it's the only text I've included in its entirety because it's fun. He describes this physical activity, which is probably something like capture the flag, but with a ball. And he says it's great because you don't need a lot of resources to do it. It's actually a remarkable nod in antiquity to an activity that doesn't depend on your resources or your social station. And he says specifically, oh, hunting's great, but it takes a lot of time and money, and this is cheap and free, and everybody can do it. And he describes the mental activity and exertion that occurs in the process of play, and the joy even in the process of playing this game with other people. And he describes how it involves running and using all of your extremities, and how it's possible to adjust your activity level and whether you're using your arms or your legs more, depending on your particular physiologic need. So I wouldn't say he discusses it in particular with regard to anxiety, but he does describe it as being a joyful activity. So he speaks to the emotional benefit of that particular activity. And just building on that, I'll mention a study that I particularly like, which is the Harvard, I think it's called the Harvard Longevity Study. Essentially, it's a group of men who were enrolled in Harvard College, I think in the 30s, whose health was followed for decades. And the study now is in its 2nd generation, looking at the children of those men. And what was found is the factors that were most contributory to a healthy, long life were diet and exercise, not smoking, moderate alcohol consumption, and meaningful relationships. That was it. That was it. And they looked at mental health metrics as well. It's fundamentals. It's Galen to a degree in terms of the basics. But yeah, that just to speak to your point on exercise in particular, and then the relational component, not necessarily with regard to exercise, but the importance of that for maintaining physical, mental, spiritual health, I think is crucial, and that's known and well validated.
I did
Michael,
want to bring
just...
up, oh, sorry, just to say, I wanted to bring up the idea at some point and we can go to it in a minute, about the ideas of community and relationships. And that's something that we see in a lot of ancient philosophies. People think of Stoicism or even Epicureanism as sort of these standalone philosophies of their own things, but the sense of community is something that I think, you only have to look at, say, Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone in America Today. It's definitely a huge contrast maybe to what was at least advised in the ancient world.
I think, Mike, to address your point about group exercise, I say this to a lot of the people I work with, and I say this to my daughter, that if there was a formula for mental health, I would say it is to do things you like with people you like. And I think to exercise with people who are your friends is probably the single best mental health prescription that I could have. I think, like, a modern fitness craze like CrossFit is so popular precisely because people go to gyms and they do classes in groups with their friends, and people cheer for them even if they come last in the exercise. And then at the end of it, you stand around in this virtuous sweaty glow, talking with all your friends, and you've done it. You've exercised, you've hung out with people you like. Frankly speaking, you've done the best thing you could for yourself that day. So there is something quite deep in the simple fact of being with people you like and moving your body. Move it with people you like. There is a world of wisdom in this prescription, right? Because it's taking care of isolation, it's making us more comfortable in our bodies, it is helping us reinforce ties. I don't think it's any, I don't think it's a sort of fallacy at all to call gyms our modern churches, right? They give people community, right? And they allow people to move. I live in Colorado, and I would say a huge part of my spiritual health lies in the fact that I have running partners. Every evening is taken up with, where are we going out tomorrow? Are we going out tomorrow? It's like there's a flurry of text messages, and then somebody meets you in the morning and you come back and it's all good. Like right now, I'm glowing because I've been out for a run today with people I like. So I'm good in some sense, right?
Figs.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just
That's
speak to your
okay.
point. Oh,
Sorry. I was
just
just
to
mute.
speak to your point as well, the exercise with the small ball, as far as we know, there was no score. So it was just an
Yes.
activity. It's a bit like
Yes.
running or like CrossFit. It was just something people were doing together. No one was keeping score. And
Very
so,
much so.
yeah.
It is atelic, right? It is lacking a telos or a purpose. It is an activity that you are engaged in just because you are engaged in it. You're not trying to do something with it. You simply are doing it, right?
It's
Also,
play in a way, right?
it's play, exactly. It's play.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
and I would say one more thing really quickly. I think there is a Stoic notion, there is a Buddhist notion, which also comes up in Iris Murdoch, that of unselfing, which is that we worry less about ourselves when we take the focus off of us and focus on something else, like a piece of art or doing charity work. So I would also express this in a formula, which I sometimes use with my clients. I'll say the best way to stop worrying about yourself is to start worrying about someone else. You want to stop feeling anxious? Well, start taking care of someone else. And trust me, you'll stop feeling anxious about yourself because you're taking care of someone else now, right? There is this selfish preoccupation with oneself, with my happiness, my goodness, my success, right? Maybe care about someone else. You might feel less anxious about yourself as a result.
Can I just say for the with regards to physical activity with people, it's interesting, and it's something I've thought about quite a lot, how in a lot of traditional societies, and this goes back to the ancient world as well, you have a lot more component of group dancing. And you think about that all throughout Latin America and cultures everywhere, traditional cultures. You have your Caileys in Scotland and things like that. And, I find that sometimes maybe in the English-speaking world, we've lost a little bit of the tradition of group dancing all the time, past the age of like going clubbing when you're, in your teens. There's not that much of an outlet for middle-aged women to go dancing anymore. So I think that there's something to be said about
Very much so.
activity together. And again, in the ancient world, that would have the group dancing festivals would have been huge. And I do want to get to some of our questions,
Yes, please.
though, and one of them is with regards to like within this one's from Anton, within a wider social perspective, how has anxiety manifested differently in the current industrial age versus classical societies? In which ways have these manifestations remained the same, and which ways are they different? Maybe Mike, that might be a good one for you.
Well, it catches me short, but I've always been interested in the idea that the cities themselves, urban life, causes schizophrenia and some of these other problems. Now, if that's true, just to throw quite a hypothesis at people they might not be ready for, but that should have also been true in Rome, ancient Rome, the atomized individual. And Samir, I heard you talking a little bit about this earlier. The idea, and I fully believe this, but it's part of my problem, that I'm the Marlboro man. I can ride off into the sunset and everything could go away and I'd be just fine. But that hasn't been true almost ever anywhere in the world. And it's very recent that you're going to take off and live in a big city and have anonymity and you can pursue romance and so forth with a whole bunch of different people. That clearly causes anxiety for a lot of people. the industrial age, this was an idea of, he's a bit of a nut, but a psychiatrist in the 60s, some of you will know the name, it's blanking for a second, Scottish, Ronald Lang, R.D. Lang. And his idea was that World War II itself was an expression of society being sick. And so to reject contemporary life would be a sign of sanity and so forth. That doesn't mean he was correct about all that, but that's an expression, I think, of what the question's getting at, right? How much of this is up to us? I'd frame it a little differently in thinking about the ancient terms, that how much is under our control, right? What do I really have control over in my life? The answer is not very much. Everything could pretty much go away. I can control some things on the edges. But yeah, that gets me again thinking sort of the Latin American societies, which have not really moved beyond that sort of extended family configuration that is so popular where we live. That's sort of a getting around the edges answer to the question. I'll pass it on.
I'll just say something really quickly. I think we have particular manifestations of anxiety that take particular forms because we have various tools with which to make ourselves more anxious now. So for example, a simple superficial example is modern parents are much more worried about their kids because they know that the kids today can go out and drive at 80 miles an hour on these beautiful interstates where they can also kill themselves. Right. So there's a different kind of parental anxiety. They don't worry so much maybe about fatal diseases, but they worry more about social pathologies than parents did in the older days. We have certain technological forms, and I think one particularly pernicious one is one that enables a kind of what I would call self-mutilation, which is far easier to do now, is that we can compare ourselves to other people way more easily. And I think engaging in non-stop invidious comparison is a kind of self-flagellation and self-mutilation that we engage in almost 24 hours a day because we're always comparing ourselves to others. And there are ways and means by which we can do this in particular fashion. So I think there is a kind of industrialized form of our anxiety because we are thrust into cities. We are made to confront extreme wealth, extreme poverty in way more perhaps damaging ways than other people did. But I think there is much more opportunity for comparison now. And the sense that my life is being evaluated, quantified, gamified, and made publicly available for consumption to others can be quite a distressing loss of, I think, autonomy. And I think a feeling that I am more of a pawn than I might have imagined myself to be. And I think this is particularly pernicious. Now, I often have this fantasy that when I go to one of these book events, somebody will say, Professor Chopra, what about your social media handles? Do you have any social media handles? And I will say, as an author of a book on anxiety, I have no social media handles whatsoever. You cannot find me online except by email, right? Because it's a tremendous source of anxiety now. And I feel when at the time I feel most protective of my daughter is when I see her encountering social media, because I think this is what will hurt her, because she will compare herself, this unique, beautiful, unique individual. She will compare herself to others, and that will make her lose some of the sense of specialness that she should have, right? Which can be a cause for a particularly pernicious form of anxiety.
But Galen deals with this explicitly, and that's in a section I've included in the book when he says, if you have 3 fields, you'll compare yourself to the guy with 30.
I remember this passage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And so, and he didn't need social media to encounter that problem.
Very much so.
And the same with social judgment in a way. I mean, he preserves an anecdote of someone who broke wind in public and died of embarrassment. And so, there still is this element of fear of what people are going to think of me.
That's right.
And I was just thinking, just bringing it back to this theme of loss. I part of what I do also involves medical decision making and decision theory. And I'm struck by, and it's documented over and over again, humans, just as a species, are more motivated by fear of loss than hope for gain. And this is known. People will work harder to avoid losing $10 than to gain $10. And so there is a sense of intrinsic, maybe we would tend toward wanting to be content with what we have and wanting to avoid losing it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have this striving, which can also be problematic. And then, of course, is maybe in some ways exacerbated by the fact that we are social creatures who are always around other people, and we need that and long for that. But at the same time, we're put into these positions where we're looking at what others have, and we are ranking and judging ourselves in relation to others.
Yeah,
Can I just ask one of the questions from the audience? And Samir, you sort of touched on this, but I'd love, Katherine, to get your additional thoughts on it, specifically with regards to technology. And does technology exacerbate our anxiety with regards to, I mean, now you can see more people to compare yourself with, maybe? I mean, is there anything to that?
Oh, that's very well documented, as I think everyone knows. I mean, social media is incredibly, I think, toxic for mental health and for anxiety for a variety of reasons. I think it discourages face-to-face interaction. I think it compromises our ability to register others' emotions. I think it also prevents us from going outside. Simple things like that, right? It's a sedentary activity. It's not an active activity. And it also takes us out of now. If we're more concerned about capturing the picture that we can post later, then we're not present in the moment, aside from wanting to get that great picture for Instagram that people will maybe comment on later. So I think that of course, it compromises our mental health for all of the reasons that we've been discussing for the last hour.
Very much so.
One of these questions from Anton again is health the absence of anxiety, or is anxiety a necessary condition of health?
May I jump in, Anya?
Please do. Yeah.
As I have been asked this question because I make a claim in my book that anxiety is a valuable form of self-knowledge, that in some ways interrogating our anxiety, making it more concrete as a fear, can tell us something about the kinds of things that we are concerned about. What makes me anxious in some ways is also it's a good window to the values that I hold dear, right? The things that I hold especially dear in this world. So it's a key to self-knowledge. I think also there is value in anxiety because anxiety underwrites inquiry in some ways. I mean, if you look on early epistemic attitudes, I think they're anxious attitudes. What's that bright light in the sky, right? What's this crazy wet liquid falling from the sky, right? There's this kind of anxiety about the world, which when pushed in certain directions, leads to certain kinds of questions being asked about the world, and leads ultimately, I think, to philosophy. I think anxiety in some sense is the kind of loam from which philosophy springs and blossoms and takes root. I think some kinds of social anxiety are useful. I think people who are not socially anxious enough are, frankly speaking, sociopathic or psychopathic, because they don't worry about what people think of them. And I think you should be worried to some extent what people think about you. You don't need to be a Nietzschean, megalomaniac and think that, well, I don't care what anybody thinks of me. But, there's some concern is a good thing, right? So I think in ways, being anxious about one's future fortunes is almost a necessary component of what I would call a kind of public health attitude towards my own fortunes. It's, of course, as we know, in the Aristotelian sense, this thing must be a kind of median or medial value between two extremes, right? Otherwise, it becomes a kind of crippling fear, or it becomes a kind of a blithe, lack of concern for one's for one's future life. Anxiety is some kind of polar point in the middle. I think I have good parental anxiety, right? I should be parentally anxious about my child. If I'm not, I think I would be a very bad parent, right? But on the other hand, to become an incapacitating parent would be anxiety having gone wrong in my world, or playing the wrong sort of function in the economy of my life.
There's a good comment here that the increase in parental anxiety may have something to do with us now seeing kids as an extension of ourselves, for longer at least than we used to. Ironically, this is a case of individualism rather than community having been a cause for lower anxiety in the past.
Very good point. It's such a good point. Such a good point.
Mike, go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, you're on mute. It sounds like no.
Am I on mute now? Okay.
Yeah, no,
I wanted to follow up on that question about health and anxiety, because I think if we could reanimate Cicero and bring the old boy back to life right now, he would agree with the proposition that looking at anxieties as a function of health is a category error. Some of you may know that term, but if you don't know that term, category error would be like calling a whale a fish. Right? A whale is not a fish. sure as hell looks like a fish. It's not a fish, it's a mammal. So anxiety definitely can make you sick if you have too much of it. But the mistake I think Cicero would agree with is that just because drugs can make you less anxious in the short term does not mean that anxiety itself is a medical problem. It's not an illness. And, this is not, in the chat, somebody surfaced the name Thomas Sass. I talked too much about this guy. I knew him briefly before he died. He lived not far away. I think he's one of the greatest writers of the Western tradition. He gets no hearing today, but that was his idea. He says, these are all real problems, but if you're looking to drugs to cure these things, even if you call them medicines, doesn't make it a medicine. There are these other philosophical things we've been hearing about that would allow you to treat anxiety, but the word treat would be sort of in quotation marks there. It's not a treatment like it is for diabetes or something. So I just want to make that point.
Yeah. I think, sorry, Catherine, if I could jump in ahead, I was just going to say it's not exactly a question of health. I think if we start to view anxiety as being one of the features of our existence, we'll stop classifying it as something that we need to get rid of, something that's a pathology, something that's a problem. But if we re-understand or reconceptualize anxiety as being something that a creature like ours has as a feature of its existence, then I think you can find some way of living with it and just accepting its presence in our life, as opposed to always being something that needs to be covered up, pathologized, treated in some way. It is part of what makes us into the kinds of things we are in some ways.
Catherine, I'd love to get your thoughts on, I feel like you're going to respond to this, but also to add more extreme forms of anxiety, like panic attacks, because I think that is something people think of, and that's sort of more in the boundary between the physical and the medicinal, that it would be interesting to have your insights on.
Yeah, and I'll also kind of bring it back to Galen a little bit in my response. He talks about lupe, which is often translated as grief or distress, but I think it could also be translated in the way in as anxiety in terms of how we're discussing it. And Susan Mattern, who's a prominent scholar on Galen, has argued similarly. Galen describes lupe along with phobos, fear, and other emotions, strong emotions, rage, envy, jealousy, as affections of the soul. And as one of those affections, it's something that we have and that we live with. And he doesn't, I think, articulate or argue for eradicating all of these affections entirely. They are part of a range of emotions and part of human existence. It's more a matter of managing the expression of those emotions. And he describes, he's not too keen on his mother, and describes her own rage and how she would throw things and bite the servants and all of these terrible things. It's about acknowledging one's affections and then seeking out means to manage them appropriately. And it's interestingly, just thinking through broadly the way he recommends addressing affections and errors of the soul, he says, seek out someone who is acknowledged for his moral character and is also recognized to be honest, and seek out that person and ask him how you can improve. And then follow his advice. And I think it's interesting because it's kind of circles back to what we're discussing of the importance of interaction and the importance of human connection, in thinking that, okay, I have these emotions, or affections in Galen's term, they could be problematic if they are taken to extreme, or if they yield action that is extreme. And one way I can manage those is by discussing my struggles with those with someone else who has experience and is honest and will discuss that with me. Wow. And then he acknowledges, which I think is very powerful, that regardless of age, we can always work to improve our souls. And that improvement of the soul, really, he draws an analogy with improvement of the body. It deserves the same attention as improvement over the body, and that regardless of age, one can and should pursue this process of improving one's soul and managing one's affections. And so I think he acknowledges it, but I don't think he really pushes for total eradication of it, rather responsible management of it.
Catherine, I was going to say in response to your response, I was struck by the etymology of the term psychotherapy, which is, psyche, Greek for soul, therapia for healing. Psychotherapists are soul healers, which of course was the term that philosophers used to describe themselves, that philosophy had something to say about this, but that thinking about it, reflecting on it, and, hopefully engaging in philosophical dialogue with someone about it was one of the ways in which we could deal with, even if not get rid of anxiety, was by understanding it and by talking about it, right?
One of the questions that we had as well that I thought was good is while it's difficult to control sometimes, can you share good ways to manage positive anxiety?
What is positive anxiety?
I guess that's like the positive aspects of anxiety and being a part of who we are and a motivator in our lives and something that helps us, I don't know, get up and do stuff.
I had someone say to me yesterday in a podcast that they're not anxious, right? And my first response was, okay, you don't describe yourself as anxious. Let me ask you, what do you care the most about? What do you have attitudes of concern about such that you would be affected negatively or adversely if those cares or concerns were to have negative outcomes, right? Now, in the way that I've rephrased this, what I'm trying to do is to dig somewhere in their descriptions of themselves where anxiety lurks or is resident. So I would say, if I was to think about positive anxiety, I would say positive anxiety is that kind of anxiety which manifests itself in our life as concern, right? As care, I think, as curiosity. I think these are the positive valences of anxiety. To be curious is to be anxious in a particular form. To be concerned is to be anxious in a particular form. I think somebody said in here, positive anxiety is called excitement. And I think there is a kind of knife edge of fear, excitement, frisson. There's a kind of thrill, perhaps, which is the knife edge of anxiety. I think if we didn't have that, adventure would be colorless, because adventure is something that we regard as having an uncertain outcome, right? I get very anxious when my favorite soccer team is playing, because I'm like, oh my God, they're going to lose and they're going to subject me to loss. But there is what I call positive anxiety, which is that I have a concern with the outcome. I don't know what that outcome is, but because I'm concerned about it, I behave differently. And I think it brings out the best in me, that I try to ensure the kind of outcome that I want. I think that is probably my best handle on what positive anxiety would be, right? A kind of care and concern for the future that doesn't result in pathological behavior on my part.
Can I give a completely different perspective on that? So when the Stoics
Yes.
thought about these emotions, they sort of have a grid, and they oppose fear right now with elation, which is what you were talking about, right? So your favorite basketball team is, they're down by 2, and as the buzzer expires, they shoot the 3-point, and you're on your feet, you're screaming.
The relief.
Exactly. And just as future is fear is anxiety, they say future elation comes out as lust. And that might take you by surprise, but this idea that the forbidden fruit, consummating the relationship, it's just going to be this transformative experience. They regard that, I think, as what you could call positive anxiety. You're anxious for this experience to come to fruition. And you have, and Aristotle and others would say it's an overreaction to what the sort of banal reality is going to be, right? Your basketball team wins, great. Well, there's tomorrow, they got another game, but or whatever. You get the kiss that you've been cultivating for all this time, yay! And then you realize, all right, well, now we got the rest of our lives to live, and so on. So that's one way of thinking about it. That's the Stoic view.
I think it's fascinating that the version of anxiety you're talking about there is so close to Freud's first formulation of anxiety, which was the first formulation of anxiety that Freud gave, was that it is a kind of dammed up libido, which results from the fact that certain kinds of social situations made it impossible for me to perform. So, for example, I am the nervous husband on a wedding night. I am the priest who's supposed to be practicing abstinence. I'm the person who's supposed to be a virgin, right? So there are these constraints on me. And as a result of that, because I'm unable to physically express myself, I become anxious as a result, right? So this is in some ways a failure of elation or excitement. I'm unable to find that consummation. And so I become anxious as a result, right? So anxiety is the inability to express that excitement that will otherwise result, right?
That's one of our very first comments was Freud says unhappiness comes from the body, decay, pain, external world forces of destruction, and relations with others. So it's an interesting contrast to see it as sort of an external source
Yes, very
rather
much
than
so.
internally.
I would say actually Freud's history with anxiety is fascinating because if you track the various formulations of anxiety he gives over the years, he goes from treating it as being something that is occasioned by the external world makes me anxious, to slowly moving inwards and saying it's my mind that makes me anxious because the conflict within my mind, which is worried about social repression, is what makes me anxious. And then towards the end of his life, he just kind of threw up his hands and said, you know what, I can't figure out this fucking thing anymore. It has something to do with the death drive. And he just kind of, it was like, I think he was frustrated by this thing that he kept trying to define. And the phenomena just were too rich to do justice to the definitions that he tried to come up with.
We only have time for a few more questions, so I want to just throw out a few quick ones. Is anxiety unique to human animals? I see shaking of heads.
Yeah, no. If you, I think of studies that involve looking specifically at cortisol levels, so the stress hormone, and there are clear examples of elevated cortisol in situations in which I can throw out a couple. So a child is separated from a parent animal when there are two dominant animals and they anticipate conflict. Other cases for more intelligent animals, when they see one animal pull a lever and get something desirable and they do the same thing and they don't get it. So again, that you could argue that's fear of loss or a certain kind of frustration, and I expect a grape or something sweet and I'm not getting it. And those are associated with elevated cortisol, which is a marker of stress. So one could call that anxiety. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add to Catherine's statement and maybe qualify it at the risk of sounding like a nitpicker and say that animals show the same physical correlates for anxiety that we do. They might not understand their anxiety in the way that we do. Like when they're experiencing that physical symptom, there's a way in which we understand it and interpret, because we don't experience physical emotions immediately. We first interpret them. So I think the fact that their interpretation of it might be different might mean that their anxiety is different from ours, but their bodies are constituted similarly enough that they have the same physical correlates for anxiety. Yes, I would say that. Our consciousness of finite time and our societal conditions might make us anxious in very particular ways, which might be unique to us as animals.
This question is with regards to medication. There's a lot of strangeness with taking medication for anxiety. If it changes one's personality, making them less anxious and thus behaving differently, is that wrong? What does it mean to one's identity? What's the real self? Big question.
Wow, deep question. Go for it, Mike.
Why don't you take that one?
Yeah.
I'd like to answer that. I'd like to answer that by way of a psychiatrist I knew here. He died a few years ago, but he was part of this same existential idea. He thought that these were not medical problems, but his name is Ron Leifer, has a bunch of good stuff out there. I'll put a link in. And he distinguished between acute problems and chronic problems. In the United States, there are many people who believe that, these things are lifelong chronic conditions and that you require medication your entire life to manage that. Ron, he did not believe that, but he thought in acute situations like the panic attack we were hearing about earlier.
Those 2 things are the big ones. The other things I don't want.
Sorry.
So
that was
he thought,
purposeful.
no, that's okay. In the moment, if you need something to smooth out a massive bump, he would prescribe pills for people who thought he needed them, but only on the short term. Whether it's bad or good, I think is a moral question. I'd rather I don't think there's really a point in answering it. Is it bad or good for you and the people you care about? The real question is it actually treating a condition? Or I mean, you could have a rotten day and you come home, you have a couple of beers, you feel a lot better, but you didn't have a beer deficiency during the day. And a lot of people, they're just unwilling to think about the problem that way. So I would just say that, but some people do, there are some very smart people that think about it in those terms.
Well, I can assure you that I feel caffeine deficiency in the mornings, and having coffee improves my mood immeasurably. But I want to say the point about changing personality is actually, I think, quite a deep one, because what we describe as ourselves is quite a complex entity, and what we take to be valuable and worth holding on to can change very much with time. I think part of the problem is that we are such dynamic creatures that we lack a real handle on what our personality really is. I was very happy to be a certain kind of person when I was in my 20s and 30s, but I might not be happy to be that kind of person now in my 40s and 50s. So some changes in personality might be welcome. And I think you're absolutely right, Mike. Since we're not isolated atoms, what also matters is whether this so-called unique idiosyncratic personality of mine is something that imposes unfair and unreasonable burdens on those who are my near and dear ones, for instance, right? So I think those kinds of decisions cannot but be complicated ones, precisely because of the ways in which our lives intersect with others. But also, I think to broaden the problem, we might be conceiving of our living in quite a different lens, that my job is to identify negative emotions and then to live my life in such a way that those negative emotions are minimized. But perhaps that's only if I conceive of the fruits of life as being as relief from negative emotions. Perhaps if the fruits of life are understood as dealing with difficulty, dealing with challenges, and accepting these in my life, then maybe life is not centered around the pursuit and the isolation and the treatment of negative emotions, but instead finding a way to live with these negative emotions so that the other fruits of life can be realized, right? If a good life is supposed to be freedom from unpleasant mental states, then perhaps the treatment of those mental states is a good way to live one's life. But perhaps if the fruits of life are learning to live with fear or to developing resilience in the face of challenges, then maybe living with those negative emotions is not such a bad thing, right? I think we also have to keep in mind is what our telos for life in some ways is, right?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating and interesting to think of how that might contrast a little bit with the Stoic philosophies of how we're supposed to deal with negative emotions. I feel like, Katherine, you're about to say something with that regard.
I was about to say I have nothing to add.
Okay,
I think they did a great job with that.
Well, then, I think that might actually be a good place for us to finish, because I know you guys have already been so generous with your time. And I think, a lot of these questions about anxiety, in some ways, they're very deeply personal ones that I hope that one of the takeaways is for people to sort of think of what role anxiety plays in their life and who they want to be, and therefore how they want to deal and view it. And I hope that this has been helpful, constructive conversation. I also want to just let everybody know again about the excellent books that all of our panelists have that go into much deeper description and understanding about philosophy of anxiety, about how to be healthy, about how to grieve and deal with breakups. I think these are all universal and eternal problems. So the insights from the ancients and from our well-read speakers is invaluable on these topics. So thank you, Samir, Katherine, and Michael, for joining me today. Thank you for our wonderful audience and your excellent questions and comments. You guys are fantastic as always. I always feel very grateful that in the big wide world of the online communities, I have a really, really nice one. So thank you for all that you guys do. And I'm going to send a follow-up email with links to everything. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel to submit them. And also thank you to Sean Kelly, our managing editor, who's behind the scenes and always helpful and helping out as well. So with that, I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks so much. Yeah, absolutely. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thanks, Katherine.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Mike.
you, guys.